Welcome. And as usual, before we get started, I wish to remind you all that this session and the following discussion are being recorded and will be uploaded to the forum's Facebook page, YouTube channel, and Instagram account. That being said, we are very excited to see you here and welcome to this year's lecture series at the Israeli Forum of Early Medieval Studies. The forum is an initiative aimed at bringing together scholars of the early Middle Ages in Israel and to help create an international community of scholars. Despite its young age and the pandemic, last year's lecture series was very successful and we were able to host 4 esteemed scholars who so kindly agreed to present their innovative work with us. This year, we have an exciting plan ahead of us, and you can find more details and register at the link that will appear now in the comment section below. On this occasion, we wish to thank the professors and colleagues who assisted us in organizing the forum. And most importantly, we thank Professor Itzik Chen, the director of the Israeli Institute for Advanced Studies, for his guidance and support. We're honored to open this year's series with Professor Emerita Leslie Brubaker of the University of Birmingham. Professor Brubaker is an expert in Byzantine art history with a particular interest in the cult of the Virgin, iconoclasm, manuscripts, and gender. She's also the director of the Center for Byzantine, Ottoman, and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham. Her books include Vision and Meaning in 9th Century Byzantium, The Cult of the Mother of God in Byzantium Texts and Images, edited with Mary Cunningham, and together with J.F. Halden, Byzantium in the Iconoclast Era, a history, who had won the 2011 Prose Award for the best publication in the humanities and also in history. Professor Brubaker's research into the cult of the Virgin in Byzantium developed into a major research project conducted together with Dr. Richard Clay of the University of Birmingham and in collaboration with the Tate Britain. This project was subsidized by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the International Iconoclasms Network. Professor Brubaker has been awarded many fellowships and honors, of which I will only mention the 3-time Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection Fellowship. And she's also a member of the Executive Committee of the Society for the Promotion of Byzantine Studies and a member of the editorial boards of the journals Gender and History and Byzanto-Slavica. Today, Professor Brubaker will talk about her new research, Looking for the Poor in Byzantium. And I'll just add that we'll have time for questions after the talk. So if you have a question for Professor Brubaker, please send me, More Hajbi, a message with your name and I'll ask you to present it, or alternatively, just send the question and I will read it for you. Professor Brubaker, thank you for agreeing to be here and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very, very much, Maura. And I would particularly like to thank you for this invitation. I've never talked in Israel before. I guess I'm not really talking in Israel now, but I'm deeply, deeply honored and thank you very, very much. I'm also petrified because this is material I have never presented before. And so I'd like a lot of comments afterwards and help if I can have it. Anyway, the paper started out that I'm about to deliver as a conclusion to a series of sessions at Leeds International Medieval Congress, which was organized by 2 of my then PhD students, Anna Kelly, now at St. Andrews, and Flavia Vanni, who is now at Birmingham. The overall title of the sessions was Skint, which is English colloquialism for broke, no money. And the papers worked so well together that Anna and Flavia have turned them into a book that we're just about to submit to CUP for review. Anna and Flavia are both in the audience, so if you have any questions for them afterwards, you can ask. They'll be here. So today's seminar, the paper I'm going to give is my work in progress conclusion to that volume. And for that reason, I too, as I just said, would for further reading. So let me start with a few words, in fact, 542 words to be absolutely precise, about methodology and the state of research. Finding the poor in Byzantium is a methodologically messy project, and it's complicated by many factors, from the definitional, what does poor mean in a pre-capitalist economy, for example, to the practical. Literary evidence is scanty and always about, rather than by, those whose standards of living were marginal, who are basically thereby rendered literally voiceless. Much of our evidence is thus inevitably representational. That is, how people, usually but not always men, who could and who wanted to record their impressions of the world around them, presented in words and in images peasants, servants, workers, beggars, and others who were less fortunate than financially than themselves. This is not self-representation. On the whole, as example, I mean, it's not self-representation at all. We have no writings from poor people except for scraps of papyri from Egypt, which Anna Kelly and Dan Reynolds, who are in the audience also, are the big experts on those. But perhaps the most voice of the poor in Byzantium are the poems of Protoprogomenos, who laments his poverty and his poor state, but it has unfortunately been discovered that this was actually a courtier who wrote these poems in the court of the Komneni, who later became a monk. He was not poor at all. So there are problems with the literary evidence, because it is, as I said, representational on the whole. The material evidence is also problematic, in part because the database is skewed by the perishability of inexpensive materials. A dwelling made out of mud, brick, and straw is just not going to last as long as a building made out of stone. And in part by the habits and funding limitations of archaeologists and art historians, who until relatively recently concentrated on elite commissions. Archaeologists rarely were financed to evaluate the settlements surrounding the churches and stone buildings that their grants had funded them to excavate. Art historians lamented the huge deposits of everyday objects languishing in museum basements, but it was only in the 1980s, pushed by Gary Vicon, who was at that point at Dumbarton Oaks, that they began to be published and discussed. One of the first museum catalogs to incorporate non-elite objects only came out in 1980. You see it here. This is Sheila Campbell's catalog of the Malco collection in Toronto. Exhibitions of the objects of daily life appeared from 1989 onward, culminating in the magnificent Byzantine Hours in Thessaloniki in 2001. But the first catalog of non-elite objects, Bridget Piderakis's volume on bronze crosses, did not appear until 2006. And as you know well, it is only relatively recently that the vast corpus of non-elite wall paintings on mainland Greece and on Cyprus have been seriously studied, most notably by Sharon Gerstel, Sofia Calapisi-Verti, and Angeliki Negropoulou. And finally, though their exoticism meant that Cappadocian monuments had been well known for a century or more than a century, it was only in 2005 that Bob Osterhout demonstrated that a number of what were traditionally believed to be monasteries were, in fact, residential dwellings without buildings to house those dependent on the wealthy family who lived in the central house. So material is appearing, in other words, but most attempts to draw the kinds of conclusions about people living in non-elite communities that scholars working on the Roman period and late antiquity have been publishing for the past decade, and I show you some examples here, have been predominantly about the economics of rural life rather than social history. Some of these economic histories are excellent, and I would single out Alan Harvey as far back as 1989, Michel Kaplan, the date of which I forgot to put in, but if I'm remembering correctly, it was 1997, and Jacques Lefort in 2002 here. But the first real attempt at a social history of rural communities in Byzantium is set to be Fotini Condilis, Rural Community Byzantium, which is due to appear from Cambridge from CUP in December. And I thank Fotini now, it's another Birmingham product. I thank her for a copy of the typescript in advance. So what can we say? That's the state, the kind of state of where we are with literature. What can we say about the poor in Byzantium? All experience, obviously, is mitigated by context. That's part of why everybody's really interested in intersectionality right now. But it has been generally agreed, incorrectly in my opinion, but it has been generally agreed that the rural poor and the urban poor lived different kinds of lives, however joined they may have been by hunger. But what has become increasingly clear, and this is why I'm a little leery of accepting this at face value, is that both the poor and the not intersected a great deal more than we used to think. This is one of the key points of Kandili's forthcoming book, and it was also stressed 20 years ago by Jacques Lepore. So this is not an entirely new idea, but it just doesn't seem to have caught on very well. Similarly, and this surprised me even more, while working men and boys and working women and girls experienced life differently, whether they were servants, freeborn peasants, or artisans, it is also clear that outside of elite circles, male and female roles were less, or at least differently, circumscribed. The old binary paradigm that associated women and children with domestic private life, civic, public life, simply doesn't work. There are plenty of textual and material evidence. Plenty of textual and material evidence that women, men, and children worked together at all sorts of tasks, including those traditionally gendered. Traditionally in the historiography gendered. As Anna Kelly has shown in an article that is about to appear in Past and Present, women as well as men worked in the textile industry. And as Marianne Stern has shown, women and men alike worked in glass production, which is incredibly reliant on muscle power. This is not easy work. But perhaps the starkest evidence comes from archaeologists who study bones. The osteological study of the bodies buried in the 14th century at Panakton, which is midway between Athens and Thebes on the Boeotian Attica border, has revealed that the muscles and joints of all adults, the 23 adults that have been excavated there, all adults, male and female, 2 of the 7 children, and they're the 2 in this tomb here, and even one of the toddlers in that tomb there, showed functional stress from repetitive overuse. So their bodies were already being ruined by work, basically. In the poor rural settlement of Panakton, women, men, and children worked side by side, and they paid the physical price. Many of these topics I've just surveyed are touched on in Skint, the table of contents of which you see here. It's all kind of runs together, but it was the only way I could get it on the page. Cecily Hennessy's chapter, for example, ties directly into the osteological material I just mentioned, although she's in fact talking about a different site, different area. 2 topics recur again and again in passing: the archaeology of the poor and images of the poor. So these 2 themes became the focus of my conclusion, and they form the backbone of the rest of this paper. The archaeology of Middle and Late Byzantine peasant life is what I'm now going to talk about. I'm using peasant to stand in for poor here, and I will be focusing on rural communities because that is where the evidence is. Unlike in Rome, there have been no published excavations on of the domestic architecture of clearly poor strata of the big cities of Constantinople, Thessaloniki, and any other city of any size. I am excluding Corinth here quite specifically because the data, which was published in the 1950s, I don't know if any of you know this material, was extensively published, but it's extremely problematic and really needs to be reworked before it's used again. I think Guy Sanders is working on this, but I am not sure. I emailed him, but I haven't had a response. Peasant archaeology and archaeology that explores less than affluent settlements in general has, as we've just seen, only recently gained scholarly traction. So the publication of the Roman Peasant Project, which you see the covers of here, in 2020 was particularly welcome. This is edited by Kim Bowes with the collaboration of a very large team. The project focused on 8 sites in southern Tuscany, mostly from the late Republican period, and asked a series of pointed questions of the evidence that they excavated. Can Roman peasants be located and excavated? Seems like the obvious beginning. Where did Roman peasants live? How did Roman peasants live? What was peasants' relationship with their locale? And how poor were Roman peasants? Now, pre-imperial material from Tuscany is obviously not directly applicable to peasant life in the East Roman Empire, but it is nonetheless worth discussing the results of Bowes' project here, if only because there's just so much evidence. She's got tons of material. And comparing the data with what we know of the far less abundant Byzantine context, helpful, exists sort of a place to start. The need for considerable caution and contextualization is clear, as noted by Bowes herself, as well as talking about when she was talking about activity profiles. The distinction between late Republican, early Empire, and late Antiques is different already. I mean, things change across time, and Cam Gray and Antonio Arnoldas have noted the same thing. So you really have to be quite careful about extrapolating from material from one period onto another one. So we can't apply her conclusions about Roman peasant archaeology directly to Byzantium, but we can get some pointers simply from asking Bowes questions of the scarce Byzantine material. So, to the turn of the questions, can Roman peasants be located and excavated? Can Byzantine peasants be located and excavated? Well, the answer is, of course, yes. She wouldn't have been able to publish 2 volumes on the topic if the answer had been no, and I wouldn't be talking about it either. So yes, peasants can be located and excavated. In the Byzantine world, this has been established as well in a number. Now, I've already mentioned the Cappadocian survey directed by Bob Osterhout at Şanlıurfa. Here, he found traces of 6th and 7th century habitation, but they had been largely overbuilt in the 10th and 11th century by large housing development. And this is a wonderful slide, but I think you can see there's houses scattered all along this kind of cliff face here. Anyway, this is a huge housing development that was apparently built by or for officers at the nearby military garrison of Akhisar. This was an extremely important survey. It was the only one that's ever been done in Cappadocia. But unfortunately, Osterhout says very little about the outlying buildings, other than that he thinks that these smaller irregular dwelling units were intended for those whose lives depended on the primary occupants. Bob, as it happens, is a very, very good friend of mine, and I asked him about this, and he was dead embarrassed. He is actually, what he was interested in was the elite housing complexes. He didn't even, I'm sorry, Bob, he's married to an archaeologist. He didn't even catalog the pottery. So, it's kind of, I'm sure it's sitting somewhere and somebody will do it. And it is a remarkable achievement that he did. But, you just kind of wish you'd been there to say, hey, look at that, look at that. But anyway, it's great that he did it. And there's a lot of material and there's a lot we can do with it. So it just makes me cry. Anyway, THS, I love the way archaeologists title their sites. 14 is a hamlet about 10 kilometers west of Thebes. I put a big blue star on it here. Yes, there we go. identified during the Boeotia survey run by John Bintliff between 1989 and 1991. It's roughly contemporary to Chanli Kilise, 10th to 12th century, but because Bintliff was surveying rather than excavating, what we know about this site is only based on surface finds, basically pottery, which was largely local cookware, though there were also some imported amphorae and one piece of glazed ware, which is always a sign of well, it's not always. In this case, it was a sign of some importation. Okay, there are also two Middle Byzantine. Oh boy, that's terrible. Sorry, I hope you can make it out. There are two Middle Byzantine settlements that have been excavated in Anatolia, Shadir Hukuk, where the excavation is ongoing, so I'm not going to talk about that now, and Boyaskoy, which is on the site of the former Hittite capital of Hattusha. Boyansoy is dated again to the 10th to the 12th century. It preserves the remains of over 20 houses, which I think you can sort of make out in this slide. They're all numbered for you. Mostly single rooms with wooden doors, packed earth floors, stoves or fireplaces, and chimneys. Small finds included metalworking tools, cooking wares, weaving tools, glass bracelets, bows and arrows. I think they thought they were in Games of Thrones, knives, and keys to what were apparently storage chests. A few larger houses, and I'm showing you the plan of one here, the one with the circle around it, had multiple rooms, often with the largest one paved in stone. It was clearly the kind of the living area, the formal reception area. And one of them, the one I'm showing you, may even have incorporated an inn of some sort or a hostel. As you can see, it opens onto the street. You can see that there. And the various small finds that were found in it looked like it was a place where they were actually serving food, which is kind of interesting. So this is one of so wait, let me whack back a minute. I was so excited by this, I couldn't believe it. So I was trying to find out where they found the small finds, but it wasn't entirely clear from the report. Many of them were in the corner there, so it looked like there was a chest there where they stored stuff. But anyway, it looks like it was an inn, really, basically. So this is a village with clear internal social hierarchies made visible by house size and house contents, and is also one of the few preserved and excavated Byzantine villages to provide evidence, however tentative, of a shop, in other words, of rural commerce going on among a rural, low, non-elite population. We also then have several later Byzantine sites, notably Penacton, which we've mentioned already in terms of the osteo material, and the new material from Lemnos, from Lemnos and Thassos, that the islands, that will shortly appear in Kandini rural communities. About half the book is based on detailed analysis sites. Because Kandili's book is still not out, I was hoping it would be by now, but it isn't. I will stick today to Penacton, which was excavated by Sharon Gerstel and her team in 1991 and 1992. Here you see the site plan with 4 more or less identifiable houses. I'm showing you one in detail here, the one circled there. The main characteristics of each of them are articulation into 2 or 3 spaces. These are slightly larger than the ones we've seen before, than the smaller ones we've seen before. One for animals, one for people, and sometimes one for storage. There were storage pithoi found in 2 of the houses, for example. Most had smoke holes in the tiled roof. Most incorporated spolia from the site. Many retained what looked like from early buildings on the site. Many retained what looked like remnants of courtyards of some kind, and you can see that here on this drawing. And this is something Lefort noted in his earlier studies as well as typical. And all contained numerous small finds. These small finds included lots of coarse cooking ware, more glazed ware than one might expect in such an evidently poor community, several knives, including one with bone handle, and a few metal agricultural tools. The more expensive metalwork and ceramics were all excavated in the church, which is on the plan. Where has it gone? Oh, there, the chapel there. Okay. To which items had the items had evidently been gifted by the community. So it's kind of social hub for the community. So that's kind of where we are with Byzantine archaeology of rural peasant dwellings. Bo's second question, where did Roman peasants live, overturned earlier seminal studies and determined that peasants were mobile, spending a varying amount of time, I'm quoting her here, a varying amount of time in a variety of places and moving from more permanently occupied houses to seasonal production sites to work huts used a few hours or days per year. This is precisely the conclusion that Flavia Vanni drew in her chapter in Skint, where she shows that stucco work was often seasonal, with laborers alternating between agricultural and construction work as the season dictated. It finds echoes as well in Alan Harvey's studies of the economics of peasant villages in the Middle Byzantine period. Seasonal working in artisanal activities, often involving movement, remained normal, in other words. So while the precise activities varied from locale to locale, and the Roman evidence varies greatly from region to region also, it seems likely that what Bose termed distribution habitation may well also have been a feature of Byzantine public life. What that means is people moved around. I don't know why it had to have such a but it is. Okay. Question 3, how did Roman peasants live? Now, this is harder for us to translate into Byzantine terms, and we certainly cannot generalize on the basis of our material evidence. In part because there is so little of it, and in part because it is so varied. The rock-cut domestic architecture of Cappadocia, for example, is hard to compare with the freestanding structures found elsewhere. We need more studies of diet based on archaeology rather than on texts. Although I would signal Demirel's chapter in Niver Anatolia and Condili's sections on diet in her new book for your future reference, but both are of course partial. It'd be nice if we could substantiate Lefour's arguments based on late Byzantine census data that most peasant farmers owned, and I love this, an ox for plowing, not two, one, a cow, a pig, of course pigs perpetuate, around 4 sheep or goats, and poultry. So at least in the late period of Byzantium, there was a fair amount of livestock moving around in certain areas of the Byzantine world. That life was more varied than one might fear is suggested by both Osterhout's finding in Middle Byzantine Cappadocia and Condili's on the late Byzantine Greek islands, and also Lefour's from the Athenite documentary evidence of kilns, mills, dovecotes, evidence of beekeeping, and other forms of what one might call artisanal exploitation of the land that went beyond pure agricultural exploitation. I would note too, as we've already seen, that glazed ware was found on 2 of the excavated sites mentioned earlier, and this signals imported ceramics, as indeed do the amphori and pithoi found on the 2 Greek sites. This in turn indicates economic surplus. In good years, at least, we are not talking about unmitigated poverty here. Total destitution tends to be an urban rather than a rural phenomenon in general. And these sites back up that generalization for Byzantium. It is perhaps worth noting here that Bose and her team found a wider range of food consumed and a greater degree of intervention in the landscape, for example, by draining wetlands, than used to be assumed for the Roman period. And in fact, one of the key conclusions that developed by her project was that Roman peasants, and I quote, probably had more stuff, occupied more space, and left a greater archaeological footprint than we have assumed. Peasant well-being, however, remained impossible for Bose's team to determine. Based on admittedly limited evidence for Byzantium, we can certainly latter statement, but we can also agree that in good times at least, and in favored regions, and for some of the peasantry, life was not exclusively miserable. It was better than it might have been sometimes. Bose's penultimate question is the relationship between the peasantry and their locale. And her answer was that it was a very tight. The same is true in Byzantium, as was noted again 20 years ago by Lefort, and has been underscored by virtually every study cited so far in this talk, and emphasized by Condili as well, who introduces the concept of visual anchors and site communities pioneered by Wesley Bernardine times this relationship. And finally, Bose's last question, how poor were Roman peasants, is, when applied to the Byzantines, an obvious, well, it depends on when and where and which peasants. Because as every study, hierarchies within local communities, and why would we ever have thought otherwise? And circumstances changed when politics or the weather or pandemics like the plague, or sometimes even the state interfered with local life. The most important takeaway from the data collected by the Roman Peasant Project in the end is that romantic ideas about an essentially unchanging pattern of peasant life are wrong. Evidence about peasants is historically and contextually contingent. Put it on the screen. Peasants are, and the peasantry is, historically specific. That for sure is true of Byzantium. So I'm going to end this paper with a literal and material return to my title, looking for, as in finding images of, the poor in Byzantium. This is in fact where I started on this project. And it came out of work not on the poor, but on the Virgin Mary, which, as I told you earlier, is something I have worked on a considerable amount. To cut a long story short, I was trying to finish a book, which is still not finished, about images of Mary in Byzantine art, and worrying about Michael Pipard's then widely publicized theory that the woman at the well, painted on the wall of a 3rd century baptistry from Dura Europos, was the earliest preserved portrait of the Virgin. What I argued then, and I think is now widely accepted, is that this is impossible because no artisan would ever have shown Christ's mother with uncovered head, because elite, respectable women were never shown with uncovered heads in any kind of formal portraiture in Dura Europos, its immediate environments, in other words, like Palmyra, or indeed in later Byzantine imagery. There are a lot of other reasons too, but that's the crux of it. It's just not possible. Here, for example, is the image of Mordecai and Esther from the synagogue, the only woman with uncovered head is Esther's maid. There are many, many other examples I could adduce, but that's straightforward. This whole exercise made me acutely conscious of women with uncovered heads. And I discovered that with very rare exceptions, women, there are some, but they're rare, women with uncovered heads are women out of place. These include fairly benign women out of place, like personifications, fairly historically specific women out of place, like mourning women. Women in the ancient world and Byzantine world were expected to remove their head covering and tear their hair even been yelled and hollered about it. It went on throughout. We can track it across the entire Byzantine period, and it still goes on today in modern Greece. Sinful Women. Hello, slide. There we go. And I'm showing you here the adulterous woman watching Christ's feet, and you can see her hair. She's contrasted with the woman with a covered head above her to sprinkle it out. And then, so we've got personifications, mourning women. Women are sort of emotionally out of norm. Sinful woman, and then servants and peasants. They're the other. Oh, can you see that, or is she hidden behind the photographs? On my screen, you can't see the peasant who's over here. Can everybody else see her sitting there with no head covering?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Female adolescents who ought to figure here because legally they remained children until they were married in most cases, and female children were not expected to cover their heads. It's only older, mature, respectable women who should be here, but they're never represented as far as I can see, except for in Byzantine imagery, except for imperial children who wear crowns of some sort. The Virgin, whose head is, and I repeat myself here, always. This is her. I was just born. Portrait. It's the photograph parents sent from the hospital of here's my infant baby girl, but she's got her hat on. She is ready to roll. This is from the 12th century Vatican process. So servants and peasants, if there were any images of peasants. I'll show you a couple in a minute, are really in a kind of a limbo position here with the alterity, with the othered women over there. Now, there are lots of pictures of female peasants. I said I was going to show you some, and here they are. But there are not a lot of them. In fact, I don't know any of them except in church contexts. You get a crowd scene in Byzantium. In fact, they never have peasant women, which tells you something. In church contexts, formal portraits of village donors sometimes appear, and on women also appear, peasant women also appear in images of the Last Judgment, as have recently been studied by, again, Sharon Gerstel. The formal portraits, and I show you one here, show women with covered heads. The Last Judgment scenes, the sinful women do not. These are, see, Last Judgment, these women are being punished for being, for having extramarital sex, and the other for refusing to breastfeed her child. This distinction underscores the point I just made. Good, respectable women cover their heads in public settings. Only bad or otherwise othered women are shown with their hair loose. But when we see images of female servants, which are also rare but not non-existent, they all uncovered heads, as you see here. So these are the two examples you've already seen. And this is a new one. This is the birth of the Virgin. So that's Anna. There's the Virgin being washed. The attendant maidservants all have uncovered heads. The only woman with a covered head other than Anna is the midwife washing the baby because she had a status position. The other women did not. So female servants, like children or women out of place, personifications, mourning women, sinners, are not accorded the formal recognition of status given by head covering. Servants, women, and children are often grouped together in Byzantine law. Tell a different story, and it is not a very nice one. Servants and peasants are visually separated from respectable women and lumped with children and sinners. Sinful women and personifications are readily identifiable. The distinction between adolescent girls and servants is less easy to determine. You can see where this is heading. Female servants are never allowed to grow up. Male peasants and servants are also essentialized and juvenilized in a slightly different way, if that's the right way to put it, and I think it probably is. Rather than head covering for men, after the 7th century, it is the chin covering, the beard, that matters. Boys, shown much more often than girls, the generic Byzantine child is always male, are beardless, of course. I'm showing you a range of examples here. But from the 7th century on, beards took on a more abstract hierarchical role than just showing age. As is well known, from the time of Heraclius onward, mid-7th, only the senior emperor was showed with a beard on Byzantine coinage, and shortly thereafter, this became the rule in all imperial portraiture. So here, dad's got a beard, son does not, despite the fact that he was certainly of an age when he would have had a beard in real life. The visual sign of maturity for men became the beard, as I said, and the maturity that a beard signified could be actual and chronological or hierarchical. A junior emperor, even if he were 50 years old, and we have examples of this, would go beardless until he became senior ruler. There are 2 exceptions to this rule of the beard showing hierarchical status. Eunuchs is one, and servants is the other. Eunuchs, and I'm showing you here a series of eunuchs, had roles in court and can nearly always be identified because of that. The distinction between peasant, servant, and adolescent male is less easy to determine. If you look at these images, you tell me. And this image drives the point home firmly. It shows a landowner chastising his steward, landowner seated, steward standing. Stewardship was a responsible position on an estate, and the steward can hardly have been an adolescent. He would have been a mature man doing a mature job. Known as beardless because he is a working class dependent of the landowner. Like female servants, male servants, however elevated in the servant status, are never allowed the privileges of adulthood. So I would conclude by saying simply that peasants had a variable existence in the Byzantine world, but that on the whole, it's probably better to be poor in the countryside than in the city, where there were fewer community safety nets. But the real points that I hope to have made today are that the poor and peasants should be neither romanticized nor essentialized, as I've already said, that there was huge community life, and it was a very stratified community life as well. It wasn't monolithic, monoform. And that while gender distinctions always need to be factored in, they are perhaps less important here, and probably elsewhere too, than the hierarchical distinctions of social status. 40
Thank
minutes. Sorry, I was hoping to get it under 40, but it was 40 minutes and 12 seconds.
Thank you very much, Professor Brubaker. And we are open for discussion. So please send me your questions. And perhaps it would be better, Professor Brubaker, if you can stop sharing your screen so that we can see the participants.
There we go.
There we go. All right. Questions? Perhaps I'll use my advantage as the moderator and I'll start the discussion. I wanted to ask you perhaps to elaborate slightly on the historical written evidence. I think most of us here are text historians, and I would be happy to learn more about the poor as represented in the texts. And as a follow-up, I would ask how the written texts correlate with the archaeological evidence. So do they go together, or maybe it's a distinct perception of the Poor and Byzantium?
That's a very, very good question. The written evidence for the poor is, of course, it's not all the same. And the legal texts tell a different story from more narrative texts, from letters. The poor are not treated well in Byzantine texts. They're treated like children. I am exaggerating, of course, and oversimplifying, but there's not as much talk about poverty as you would think, and when there is, it is often rhetorical. One of the things that came up in the chapters in Skint is that people talk about the poor, but they're not really talking about the poor. They're talking about themselves and using the poor to make another point. It's like, how, Ginty Nelson's famous phrase about women are good to think with. Well, women are good to think with, but so are servants. You can project all kinds of ideas on the poor, on peasants, on servants that are really about yourself, but they give you a way of talking about other things. So the texts are not wildly helpful here, although sometimes, and particularly hagiography, you get glimpses of lives in poverty that you probably, that would be hard to get any other way. So there are some useful bits, and the legal texts are also useful often as well. Trying to correlate the legal texts with the archaeological evidence works fine if you're looking at census reports. If that kind of written report, you can actually see, and then that's why I kept mentioning Jacques Lefort, because Jacques Lefort was basically dealing with written evidence, which he was then trying to map on to archaeological finds. And he was able to do that to a certain extent. But again, there's only so far you can go with that. But it can be done a bit. So there is some overlap. But you also have situations where the text tell you one thing and the visual evidence tells you something else. And then, you're going to have to go with the visual evidence. I mean, if it's archaeological, not if it's a picture, because God knows pictures lie. But but if it's archaeological, you are. And then you have to start thinking about what was this author trying to do. I'm sorry, I'm going on too long about this because it's something I've worried about quite a lot. But it's a good question, so thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a comment from Anna Sitz.
Hello, thanks so much for your lecture, which I very much enjoyed. Yes, I just wanted to make a comment because I'm actually excavating Byzantine peasants at Labranda in Turkey. I'm excavating a cemetery from the 10th or 11th century. And actually, I've been coming to some of the same conclusions as you, that they are not actually as poor as maybe we would initially assume. And I'm basing that on grave construction itself. So I'm also working with an anthropologist who's looking at the bones, which is a great resource, but actually looking at the grave construction itself, where we see at this cemetery in Labranda, significant effort put into digging certain graves. The graves are all pretty homogeneous, digging them into the rock, covering them very carefully, marking them all with crosses on bricks. So again, we see a population that is very much concerned with maintaining a certain appearance of its necropolis and maintaining a certain status for each member of the dead, including infants. Babies and infants get the same.
Yeah, including the newborn. Wow.
Yes.
Can you send me? Do you have interim reports on this?
I do have interim reports, and I'd love to send them to you.
Oh, please do, because I don't know that, and I need to. Thank you very, very much.
I'll email you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this new book coming out, this new edited volume, as well as Fotini's book.
Well, this was a puff for the book. Let's see.
Excellent. Thanks so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We have a question from Barbara Crostini. I agree with you. It cannot be Mary at Dura, but who do you think she is? Rebecca at the well?
Or else the Samaritan woman at the well. I actually think it's probably the Samaritan woman at the well, because it's in a baptistry, and there we have other examples of the Samaritan woman at the well as baptistry, because it was typologically linked to rebirth and change and all that stuff. So I can't remember the exact citations of it because I haven't thought about it for a couple of years. And I'm old, and so my mind is very sieve-like, but that's what I think it is.
Thank you. Now we have a comment from Linda Safran.
Hello.
Hi, Leslie. It's so nice to see you and to have heard from you. This is actually a good follow-up to what Anna just said. I'd like to put in a plug for the South Italian archaeological work, specifically on village archaeology. It's a field that's exploded in the past 20 years, especially conducted by Professor Paul Arthur of the University of Salento and his students. They're on top of all the latest approaches to osteoarchaeology. They look at grave goods, they look at teeth and bones, and there are lots of interesting things that emerge from the study of Byzantine villages. And of course, there are more post-Byzantine excavations, but at the core is the 9th to 11th century Byzantine presence in southern Italy. So I encourage people to be more aware of that work. It's really, really very interesting.
Yeah, I talked to him about that a couple of years ago, but very little had been published. But or has it? Did I just miss it, or what?
No, there are publications in both English and Italian, of course,
Yeah.
on a couple of Byzantine villages that I can think of. I'll be happy to.
Yeah,
send you
yeah, Linda, let's
biography.
be in touch about that. Yeah.
Or you can look in my own book on the medieval Salento and get a
Which of course.
cursory overview and some bibliography there.
Okay, thanks, Linda.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. We have a question from Daniel Reynolds. Do you get much sense of the regional distinctions in peasant life in Byzantium, or are we not quite at that stage yet? If so, can we identify areas where peasant life was comparatively better?
I think we're not. I wish we were at that stage, Dan, but I don't think we are. I also think it's not just geographical, but it's also time. There are times when if a war is going through your region, even if they might not hit you, they're going to hit the surrounding towns, or they might, and things get disrupted. So, but I really think I think we're just not ready to do that yet. Except to say one thing, which is that if you live on the coast, you always have fish, so you eat better. I mean, that is clear, but hey.
All right. Our next question is from Joseph Hadley. Was there a large amount of ethnic diversity in the Poor of Byzantium? What evidence do we have for this? Is it depicted in artwork, or do we have census records from the time?
We don't have census records for the time. It is not depicted in artwork, but there was a lot of ethnic diversity. And we know that because of skull measurements. I didn't know this until I started doing it, but there's apparently round skull and elongated skull or something. And since you will know the answer to this and I don't, but the Penocton site I showed you have two quite distinct types of skull formations or whatever they're called. Clearly, I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know what these are, an osteo. Definitely not an archaeologist. But the pictures in Sharon Gerstel published this in Hesperia many years ago now, and you can actually see the differences in the head types. And we also know from texts about populations being moved around and imported. A whole bunch of Slavs were whacked into the Peloponnese, for example, at one point, and they raised horses, and that was fine. But so we know from texts that this happened. But we also know that from looking at skulls, that this happened as well. And Paul Geary has done some work but that's in Gaul, so that's not very helpful for this conversation, showing the exact same thing. And what usually happens is you find what looks to be the kind of outside group, and that's certainly what happens at Penocton, the people who are buried in the pit graves on the edge of the cemetery, are the males. The women marry into the elite group, and they get buried in the church with the men with whatever the elite skull type happens to be. Paul found that, Patrick found that in Gaul, and Sharon found that in Penocton. I don't know if that's two examples is not statistically very significant, but to answer your question, yes.
And I'll just mention Professor Geary gave a talk last year in our forum, and the recording is available in our Facebook page. Our next question is from Henriette van der Blom. Please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Leslie, very much for your very well illustrated, as always, presentation. So my question is probably going a little bit beyond the material evidence and the visual evidence that you've shown, but I wonder whether, and you've probably thought about this, but whether it's possible to reach the poor via charity work, whether in a religious setting or not. I imagine a lot of that happens in a religious setting, but there might be some outside of it. Anything you can say on that?
Yes, in fact, there are 2 or 3 articles in the volume of Skit on that precise topic. So I urge you to read the book. One of them written by our own Jessica Barcelona. So there you go. Although what she concludes is that it was more words than action. But this is one of those cases where you've got the, the bountiful ladies of the parish kind of thing, talking about what the wonderful stuff they do for the poor. It's never the ladies of the parish. Ladies of the parish were actually much better than the bloody monks, who the monks go on and on and on about it and appear not to have really done much of anything. Whereas the nuns, Lauren Wainwright's chapter in the volume, actually did do a lot of charitable work in their neighborhoods, but they don't really they're talking about themselves. They're not really talking about the people they're helping.
So they are the ones who use it rhetorically to talk about themselves rather than actually talk about.
Yeah. But sometimes they actually did do something as well, but no.
Thanks, Leslie.
Thank you. Our next question is from Radka Palova. How can we think about bodily anatomical difference of peasants through nutrition, work, etc., and its construction in our sources?
I'm not sure we can think about it in anything about it from our written sources. We can tell a lot about it though from bones. And that's what the 2, Fotini does that in her new book. And the book of the Byzantine Anatolia book has a chapter on that. There are scattered articles about this and what bones tell you about the nutritional deficiencies or not deficiencies of peasants, but I don't think texts are going to give us much of anything to go on here. Teeth, of course, are also very, very good for showing deficiencies and stuff like that.
All right. Our next question is a long one by Agni Agathi, and I'm sorry, the rest is cut off. First, my thanks, congratulations, and admiration to Professor Brubaker for this fascinating paper. This may be difficult or even impossible to answer, but I would like to learn about the cultural makeup of rural communities. Considering the archaeological site discussed by the professor, is there any material, architectural, or even genetic evidence suggesting that these settlements were inhabited by people of heterogeneous cultures or ethnicities?
Yes. Certainly, as I said, the Penocton site shows that. The grave evidence from Chanli Kilise Bomb Osterhout site also shows that. And the Anatolian evidence that Niewerner's volume publishes also shows it. So yeah, we can say that. I'm sure not every site, but plenty of sites. So.
Okay, I'll mention Maria Parani's comment. Thank you very much for your talk. Just a reference that might be of interest to you, though in Greek. Byzantium without glamour, the humble objects and their use in the everyday life of the Byzantines. Published in 2018, and I can send you the title and link later.
Oh, Maria, I would be very, very grateful for that. I really would. Thank you. And hello.
Okay. We have some more time If people want to ask questions, you can also raise your hand and just ask your questions.
Or you can let me go have a drink. Which I would really quite like to do.
Oh, Maria Perani, please.
Just to say
Hey,
hello.
hey, hello.
Nice to see you. Thank you very much for this presentation, and especially for pointing out the youthfulness. Always the male and female attendants are represented young, and that's why the women are without head covers. But thank you very much for this insight into the reasons behind this treatment in the images. Very, very interesting. I also, in terms of the visual evidence, I wanted, the Blacherna mural in Arta.
Oh yeah.
With all this the little scenes around the working people, the men and the women, including a khazar, because it was mentioned before whether there was evidence for ethnic diversity, a khazar selling caviar. So, and again, there the women, they are forced to work as sellers, but they are fully covered, even though in public they are fully covered, and I think that's a very rare testimony to the urban. I just wanted to ask, do you equate the poor with the peasants? I mean, because you mentioned yourself that the peasants could have property and they could administer it and bequeath it and donate it. So, what do you think?
I think this. First of all, can I just say this is Blacherna stuff? This is a wall painting from a church in Arta, which Maria has written a wonderful article about, which I suggest you all read. We're talking about the market scenes around the edge, and it's a wonderful article. So, and you've got with charts to show how it works, and it's really good. Anyway, and yeah, and it's great. The procession stuff I'm doing, I used that article a lot when I was trying to figure out what was going on in that. Anyway.
Thank you.
No, it's wonderful. The poor peasant thing I have been agonizing about. Peasants are obviously used, the term peasant is used to people who were working the land, except a lot of them didn't work the land. They were milling, and they did artisanal activities too. Whereas the poor, so poor people can be poor anything. A peasant can be poor. Most peasants, or at least many more peasants than I originally thought, were probably not poor. I mean, they were rich, but they were not destitute. So I think it's a tricky interface. And I think all the images we have, with one exception and there may be more, but I can only think of one off the top of my head, show peasants rather than the poor. The only exception I can think of is, the poor Lazarus, Dives and Lazarus, those images. But, those are so formulaic. It's kind of hard to go anywhere with that. And the figures usually, but I actually hadn't thought about the Dives and Lazarus thing, and I will do that until this minute. I will do that. Check that.
Maybe also the images of Julian, the tax collector, where those in front of him, again, it's very formulaic, but what is interesting in that is that sometimes you have the three ages, not just youth. You have the three ages there. And so, again, it's a formulaic conventional treatment, but it's interesting how they couch it in these terms.
And it's really interesting because in all of the Gregory of Nazianzus manuscripts that do this, they're constantly going back to that three ages, always of men, not of women. It's over and over, not just in that scene, but in lots of others. And you wonder, how that kind of happened. But that's an issue for a different time. But yeah, I will go back and look at those again. I did look at them at some point, but obviously I better go look at them again.
Well, thank you very much,
Thank
Leslie.
you
It
very
was
much.
great seeing you.
And you, I like your hair, by the way.
All right, our next question is from Shacha Olinsky.
Thank you, Professor Brubaker, for this wonderful talk. I'm curious, do you see a difference, or are you able to detect a difference between images or visual depictions of poor people, what we would deem poor people, and slaves?
There are no images of slaves that I know of. Byzantines obviously had slaves, but they don't seem to have had as many slaves as everybody else did. There's a whole thing there in the 11th century, by the 11th century, the only mentions you get of slaves in the Byzantine sources, I'm sorry, this is something I've been worrying about, obviously. The only mentions you get of slaves in the Byzantine sources are, I freed my slaves, in wills, that kind of thing. 12th century, there are no more mentions of slaves that I know of. It's possible there are some, but it's not anything you see a lot of at all. But how you would actually identify a slave as opposed to a servant in an image, I simply don't know. And I wouldn't know how. It's like, how do you, yeah, anyway. So, but it's funny because you think of the land work was never done by slave labor in Byzantium, as far as we can tell, for example. It was all peasants. You know, and they could have been landed peasants or they could be dependent peasants, but it was peasants. Yeah. So slaves were almost always domestic slaves when we have them, but we just really don't hear about them very much. So it's,
thank you very much. I agree with that. I know that sometimes there's a tendency to interpret certain mosaics, let's say, as depicting slaves, but I have to say I find it very difficult to determine whether or not they are actually slaves or free servants.
Is this something you're working on?
Yes, I
would love to hear what you're doing then at some, I mean, obviously you don't want to launch into a lecture.
In the West, though. Yeah.
Well, where there's a lot more evidence in the West for slaves than there is in Byzantium. Yeah.
Yep. I will write you. We can talk later. Thank you.
If I can follow up on Shacha's question about the West, do we have the same depictions of the beard and the hair and the childish-like look in the West as well?
I have no idea. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, I could make something up, but I would be making it up. I don't know the answer.
I'm sorry for
but Micah might.
Question.
Micah might know.
Well, the word glaber in Latin is both beardless and bald. And that's tricky. Sometimes it might be a young guy who's beardless and who acts like a bold child, but it might also be a grumpy old geezer. So I mean, I've come across figures in monastic literature of that kind, and you think, what the hell is glaber? How do you translate this in this case? Is it an oldie or is it a youngster? One thing about peasants and poor, you might just it's online, leaf through the Utrecht Psalter, which is totally full of images of your bog standard Carolingian poor, which are basically powerless, and which include women and children stretching out their hands in despair, and on the other hand you got a lot of peasants tilling the land, doing all sorts of rather wonderful things. And the other thing I thought about, if I might add this, is your images are representing the what the elite wants. Yeah.
Not all of them,
Yeah,
not the
not all of
village
them,
churches,
some of them.
but most of them. Yeah.
And I wonder whether they actually are an instrument in keeping people in their place. Because if I got you, if I understood you right, this is a pretty mobile society, and it's not the poor aren't that downtrodden, and they have opportunities or whatever. I mean, there's that. Is it so that the iconography is actually reinforcing the the worldview of the elite or whatever? Not always, you say. Well, that I think.
No, but Micah, that is so interesting because, and I will go do some more work on this, but most of the images we have of servants in that context are in manuscripts. And manuscripts, of course, are the preserve of the rich, because nobody could afford them, the rich and the elite and the educated and all that. So you could well have a really good point.
Okay.
Thank you. I will check that out. I'm also going to double check that it's only in, or at least mostly in manuscripts, but I think it is. I was struck by that actually when I was looking at this stuff.
All right.
So,
Thanks. Oops.
but the Utrecht Psalter it's a really good thing, and I will go look at it. But I was thinking about the closest equivalent to the Utrecht Psalter in Byzantium, which is the marginal psalters, and they don't have that, which is interesting too. So anyway, sorry, that's a different tangent, but thank you for that. That's really interesting.
Thank you very much. So if we don't have any more questions, we can give Professor Brubaker a rest and she can have her drink, unless anybody wants to have some question. All right. So please join me again in thanking Professor Leslie Brubaker for such a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your great questions, I have to say. Really, really good. Thank you.
Our next meeting will take place on November 24th, and our next speaker is Professor Warren Brown of the California Institute of Technology, who will talk about freedom and unfreedom in the Carolingian formulae collection. We will circulate the flyer soon, so stay tuned. And in the meantime, I wish you all a wonderful fall semester and stay safe. And thank you, Professor Brubaker, once again.